If you think back decades earlier, liberals were the champions of free speech. Yes, it was the conservatives at a certain moment in time who were the censors. You know, they sought to curb blasphemy and obscenity, sedition, and so on. And the liberals said, no, free speech is the way we want to go. And yet today, that has flipped. If you look back to what left-leaning officials and authorities and figures said, let me just give you one quote. This is Samuel Gompers, who is the founder of the American Federation of Labor in 1886. He said this. He said, the freedom of speech has been granted to the people in order that they may say the things which, misquoted that, have not been granted to the people in order that they may say the things which please and which are based upon accepted thought, but the right to say the things which displease, the right to say the things which may convey the new and yet unexpected thoughts, the right to say things even though they do a wrong. Now that is not a sentiment now carried on by the left in today. What has happened?
Well, again, I see that it's a consequence of continual agitation by, I would say, a minority of the left, the radical left in particular, and those are people who are Marxist/neo-Marxist in their fundamental ideological orientation and have joined that in an unholy union with the worst of French postmodernism. And they push forward ideological certainty. And the thing that's really distressing about that is that if you know anything about the history of oppressed people, let's say, much as I hate to engage in that particular form of dialogue under the current conditions, it's pretty obvious that its freedom of speech is a freedom that's particularly important for people who don't have anything else. Right? If you're supporting freedom of speech, you're not supporting the status quo. I mean, just think about it. Let's use the logic of the radical leftists and assume that society is a tyrannical hierarchy and the people at the top have the upper hand in everything, including access to communication. These people are not your friends. They would say, you know, and mark my words, that's the sounds of the barbarians pounding at the gates. Right. Yeah, that's, I'll tell you again too, that use of inchoate, what would you call it? Inchoate sensation is the best formulation of their argument. And there's not much difference between knocking on the doors and knocking on you. So keep that in mind. It's not amusing. There's nothing to it. There's nothing for it. The thing that's also quite appalling is that there's no evidence whatsoever that the people who are conducting these protests know what it is that they're protesting against. You know, I was in the midst of a discussion attempting to make the case that it's freedom of speech that is what people who have nothing still have, right? So if you look at the tyrannical structure of our society, let's say, the people at the top have access to means of communication. Everyone knows that. It's the people at the bottom who have the right to say what they think, however badly they say it, that enables them to get a toehold into the system and to make their suffering known. That's what freedom of speech is for. And so, like, what's the protest against that? And I'll tell you, you know, that the radical neo-Marxist types, they speak the language of power, and that's what they're speaking right now. And if you want to live in a world where everyone speaks the language of power, then just let them do what they're doing and see what happens. I wouldn't recommend it. It's not a pretty road. And you're all in a position, you're all in a situation in your life now where you have to make decisions about this sorts of things. Like, is this the sort of institution that you want this to be?
The world moves fast these days. Markets rise and fall. Policies change, and uncertainty seems to be the only constant. But there's something that's held its value for thousands of years: physical gold. Right now, Birch Gold is offering something extraordinary. When you open a tax-sheltered IRA in physical gold, they'll send you a free 1-ounce American Silver Eagle for every $5,000 purchased. And here's the brilliant part: you don't need to spend a dime out of pocket. Simply convert your existing IRA or 401k. Now, you might be thinking the markets are doing fine. Why bother? Consider this: we're facing a national debt of $36 trillion. That's not a problem that disappears overnight, no matter who's in charge. In fact, we can barely cover the interest payments, let alone tackle the principal. This isn't about doom and gloom. It's about being prepared, about taking responsibility for your financial future. It's about making intelligent choices while opportunities present themselves. Take control of your retirement strategy today. Text Jordan to 989898 before December 18th to receive your free information kit on gold and to claim your eligibility for free silver on qualifying purchases. That's Jordan to 989898. And don't wait. This offer expires December 18th.
Now, one of the arguments against what you said about the pronouns was that, well, after all you're being asked to do is to say something that is reasonable. It's not unreasonable to address somebody by the pronoun that they prefer. And yet, if you think of any kind of speech which is prescribed, imagine a statute that said, people shall use the words hello and please and thank you in their conversations. That statute is untenable, yes? Because it now requires people to use certain words in their conversations, even if those words are reasonable themselves. So that is not the question. And it was not your case you were making that using a pronoun was unreasonable in itself. Do I have that correct?
Well, yeah. First of all, there's a couple of things I'd like to say about that. I looked at the process by which the Ontario government formulated its legislation with regards to the pronouns and the consultation process they used. And the consultation process was deeply flawed. They contacted activists and say, let's activists of the trans community. Okay, well, there's a couple of things I'd like to say about that. The first is, there is no trans community, right? Trans people are as diverse as any other group of people, and to the idea that somehow because of one of their attributes they constitute a homogeneous group is well, you'd think that that would be a falsehood, that the people who are concerned about treating groups of people adequately would be loath to put forward. But even more importantly, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that the activist types are actually representatives of any of the communities that they hypothetically activate on behalf of. It's like they're not elected, they're not appointed, they don't poll. They do this. They say, look, here's a group. It's a minority group and it's oppressed. I'm a member of that group and therefore I stand for the group. It's like, actually, no, you don't. You don't stand for your group. You maybe stand for yourself. I don't stand for men and I don't stand for white men. I'm not entitled to speak on their behalf. And so the idea that it's the trans community that wanted this is a completely unsustainable idea. It's certainly unproven. I've had like 40 letters from trans people since I started to engage in this, call it this chaotic battle. And only one of them was mildly critical of what I was doing. All the other ones, and there aren't that many trans people, so to get 40 letters is actually quite a few. And I'm not saying that this is a scientific poll, but it's at least as scientific as the process by which the Ontario government generated its legislation. And I'm not... And I'm not generating legislation. And what these people said to a person was, I didn't ask to be the newest whipping boy for the radical postmodernists. All it's done is made my life more difficult. The basic letter would say, well, I'm transitioning from one gender to the other, and it's very difficult, and I'm not sure that it's the right thing to do. And this has made the process spectacularly more difficult on all fronts. It's like, and these people don't speak for me, and just because they say they do, that doesn't mean they do. And so the other thing that we seem to have swallowed as a society is this crazy notion that, well, first of all, that we should be portioned up into our different minority groups, which I think is a return to tribalism and unbelievably dangerous. I can't really think of anything more dangerous than that. And then we've swallowed the idea that if you identify yourself as a member of a minority group and then you bring forward a grievance, you have to be treated as if you're a valid representative of that group. It's like, well, why in the world would we do that? It's guilt, I suppose. Maybe that's part of it, or I think it's mostly guilt. You don't want to stand up and say, well, you know, who died and made you king, so to speak, you know? And
Can we stay on that logic for a moment? The idea. So this compelled speech material seems to insist upon treating people not as individuals, but as members of groups, to either blame them or to favor them as a member of a group. If we take that logic and extend it, you know, that the group identity thing becomes intersectionality, where you're not just belonging to one group, but you also have these characteristics. Spin that out for us. What is the logic of that? Where does it lead us to?
Well, okay, so the first thing I would say to everyone in the room is I don't think, and this is why I decided to do what I did right from the beginning, you know, is that I don't want to play the group identity game. I don't want to construe the world in those terms. And I'm not going to use terminology that would require me to formulate my thoughts in that manner. I think it's a terrible catastrophe to divide us all up into our tribal entities. I don't see anything positive about that at all. So I just don't want to go there. And then second, I would say, and maybe this is even more relevant, you may or may not have heard about intersectionality, but intersectionality is a new development on the radical left. And I think it's actually, if I wasn't so intent upon seriousness in these matters, I would be constantly laughing about intersectionality. And the reason for that is that the radical left has discovered its own Achilles heel. So look, what's the problem with dividing us up into groups? Well, there's many, and the descent into tribalism is not least among them. But the next is that, well, it turns out that we don't fit into one group, any of us. We fit into multiple groups, and it's not obvious at all which of those groups should be of paramount importance. You know, there's a racial group and an ethnic group, and there's groups of intelligence, and there's groups of temperament, and there's groups of attractiveness, and there's groups of wealth, and you can multiply them really indefinitely. And I do mean indefinitely, because you can categorize a finite number of entities a virtually infinite number of ways. And so the intersectionalists discovered this. They said, well, there's let's say there's Latinos and there's Asians. It's like, okay. Well, wait a minute, there's male and female Latinos and there's male and female Asians. So do we treat, is the division into two enough, or do we need a division into four? Well, then there's socioeconomic class of male and female Asians and male and female Latinos. And you can keep fractionating the groups, and technically without end, and you actually see this happening in real time, so to speak, as the acronym for the LGBT activists continues to expand, really without end. And see, what's at the bottom of intersectionality, and this I suspect will be discovered eventually by the radical leftists if they get that far, is that you have to fractionate the groups right down to the individual. And that's what Western culture discussed and articulated, discovered and articulated over the last 5,000 years. It's like, oh, right, the group isn't the paramount division, it's the individual, because unless you treat each person like an individual, you're not taking all the intersections into account. And so it's extraordinarily comedic. But it also isn't as if it's treating everyone as they're an individual, as if they're an individual is an instant solution that will bring us to utopia. You know, it's like Winston Churchill said of democracy, right? It's essentially the least terrible approach we have. And life isn't the sort of problem that is amenable to an instantaneous utopian solution, but our best bet is to meet each other with the desire for peace and productivity on this stage that enables individual interaction. Because then we meet soul to soul, so to speak. And we also meet in a domain that we bear responsibility for as individuals. And that's also extremely important, right? You should be responsible for what you say. You should have to suffer the consequences of what you say, not least so that you learn. And so the individual is paramount as far as I'm concerned. I think that's the fundamental principle of Western civilization. Now, it's not only the West that has come across that discovery, but I think we've done the best job so far of articulating it. And so we don't want to lose that, because the alternative isn't a multicultural utopia. The alternative is a descent into tribal barbarism. And there are people who would be just as happy if that happened. But I would suggest that it's not a destiny that an awake person would long for. Yeah.